Welcome to the Deep Dive,
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deep Dive, Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast. RJ, the Kraken are in the midst of their first 5-game losing streak of the season. Will it be their last? I don't know. I keep saying first 5-game losing streak, and that implies there will be a second. I hope there isn't, but given some of the subject matter we're going to talk about today, I don't think people are really going to care about the semantics of it all because the Kraken are on that losing streak, and it has raised a lot of questions around this team about the players, coaching staff, general manager, the composition, everything around this organization. And we're going to kind of get into it here as the Kraken enter the holiday break with all of these questions. And we'll talk about, our thoughts on all of them, and also how we think Kraken fans might have to, it's time to maybe shift expectations a little bit, enter the new year and the second half of the season, maybe looking for different things out of this team than just the win-loss record and all of that stuff. It just kind of feels like we're there, but also Kraken made a big trade this week, RJ, that I know we've talked a lot about, but there's still some good stuff to go over here in the deep dive format.
Right. There's a lot of things to cover. The trade I'm looking forward to talking about. I think that's a good deal. And yeah, as we approach the Christmas break, there are certain mental shifts that I think kind of need to happen. There are some maybe unpleasant conversations that need to happen. I know Dylan and I were procrastinating a long time on hitting record to start this episode. For whatever reason, this is one that we just kind of didn't want to get started, but here we are. And it's going to be an episode. There's going to be some big important takeaways, but it might not always be the most pleasant stuff.
Yeah, I think, we could maybe end on the stuff that is worth looking forward to still from this team. And, I think there is some good stuff to talk about around that Kaapo Kakko trade that we will hit on in just a moment. But first, RJ, got to fill everybody in on our new deep dive sponsor. The law offices of Rico Tessendor came aboard last week. And I just want to say a quick thank you to everybody for the really warm welcome and all the kind messages in the comment section for last week's podcast and on Discord about Rico coming on board. That was really cool to see. And RJ, you can tell everybody kind of how this came together again.
Right. So Rico reached out to us and wanted to be a part of what we're doing. He's an avid listener of the podcast. He's a Kraken season ticket holder, and he really believes in what we do with the ECH community, and he wanted to be a part of it. So he reached out to us. We had some conversations with him, and it was clear that he was a great fit to sponsor the deep dive. So it was really great how that all came together. And like Dylan said, I love how the community kind of came together and was so happy for us, happy for Rico, and this partnership starting up.
Yeah, supporting an ECH community member, supporting somebody who's been a hockey fan since childhood up here in the state of Washington. And while we hope none of you ever need his services, the odds say at some point someone out there will be involved in an accident, whether on the road, at work, or anywhere in between. And when we are, we hope you call Rico at 425-778-9800 or visit his website, ricotessendor.com, to schedule a free consultation. He's won millions of dollars for his clients and helped thousands of people in the greater Seattle area. And as a fellow member of the ECH community, we know he'll help you too. RJ, Kaapo Kakko comes over. Ron pulls the trigger, makes a big trade, right? Something that, we were maybe not thinking that he would do. We talked on this podcast last week about the idea of Ron making a trade for one of those two notable names out there, Dylan Cozens or Kaapo Kakko. We had talked about it, thought Kaapo Kakko could make sense, maybe more of an actual fit for the Kraken. I know you're a big Dylan Cozens fan, but Ron actually goes out there, makes the move. Will Borgen goes out the door. A couple one mid-round pick and a later round pick go out the door. And in comes Kaapo Kakko, who has now played 3 games already for the Seattle Kraken. This trade really did happen right after the deep dive last week. And, he's starting to come into his own, still has not had time to practice, hasn't even been to Seattle. Like maybe today might be his first day in Seattle after this road trip that he joined the Kraken on. And so far, I think the results have been promising. Maybe they're not all the way there, although last night's game I feel like was a big step forward. But so far, I feel like the overall results are promising for having Kaapo Kakko join the organization.
Right. And as we look at the player first, I think the first couple games that he played with the team, I think still trying to figure some things out. He didn't play a whole lot. He took shorter shifts, right? Just trying to get his feet wet. But I think this last game shows what he is capable of. And you look at the game score, even, you look at some of the analytics, right? He had the highest game score on the team, by hockey stat cards, right? And that's pretty impressive. He scores a goal, of course, off the faceoff. He gets his first as a Kraken. And I think you see things really starting to gel for Kaapo Kakko. You see some chemistry starting to form with him and Matty Beniers and Jaden Schwartz on that line. And so I think promising is a good word that you used as far as the player that the Kraken have brought in. And I think we'll only continue to see growth here. He's played 3 games for the team. He has practiced with the team 0 times. So there's a lot that can be learned and gained from just one practice with your teammates. And we still haven't seen that yet. So I think there's a lot of promise there with Kaapo Kakko.
He's already been through the line blender, right? Like he's already had to play with different teammates game to game since joining this team. And like I said, he hasn't even been to Seattle yet, hasn't practiced with the team yet, really has not been able to be fully integrated into the organization in that way. That being said, last night's game especially, it showcased his defensive ability, what he can do in the defensive zone, whether it's utilizing that size and being able to really bully, another team's defenseman in a battle for the puck high up in the zone, and you're able to get a zone clear out of the defensive zone, or whether or not it's his ability to read a play and react to it, use his active stick, get it out there, intercept a puck, was able to do that, and then spring Jaden Schwartz on a wonderful breakaway chance in the third period last night. That was all really encouraging to see. That was the stuff that we knew we were going to get from him, though. What I've been really intrigued by is how well the offensive fit seems to be, or at least it looks like it can ultimately end up being, as he is somebody who is willing to go to that net front. In the games that we had seen from the Rangers, the 2 times prior this season, he was a little bit more of like a perimeter power forward, wasn't doing as much of that net front work. And so I talked about that a little bit on Discord before that trade, actually. Just somebody had kind of asked, about him on Discord. And I said, well, he's a power forward, but he's kind of doing more of the like below the goal line work and stuff, because that's what we were seeing from the Rangers. But I was happy to see that, this team needs a net front presence. He was able to step into the lineup. He has started to become that net front presence for them. And I think that as he gets more comfortable, is able to start building chemistry with Matty Beniers, who it seems like he's really going to be paired with, that's only going to kind of grow, and the dividends in the offensive zone will only kind of increase from here.
Yeah, the net front presence was my biggest takeaway from Kaapo Kakko, and the fact that he's willing to go to those areas. The Kraken just have so few players that can do that. And the ones that can, like a Jaden Schwartz, don't have the frame that Kaapo Kakko does. And so it makes Kakko harder to push out from those areas. He almost had the tying goal against Colorado where he was just sitting in front of the net and got a good chance at the rebound. But those are the kind of chances that you want to see from him more. And I know that, like Eddie Olczyk on the broadcast was just raving about him going to the net because so few players will. And so it's great to see that from him. And I'm sure we'll see that going forward. But I do like the early indications of what he's brought. And he just brings an element to this team, and the way he's able to use his size. It almost highlights, we saw comments from various people talking about how, I think it was maybe Maddie in the Discord, how Kakko's size, it really makes you realize how much of a lack of size the Kraken have in their forwards. Otherwise, he makes them all look small, and he makes them all, it kind of highlights how little they engage physically. So it's just good to see one guy who's kind of helping fix that problem.
Exactly. The other thing that I've been happy with, and he was able to get a goal doing this, again, scored before he's practiced with the team or visited Seattle. It's another kind of, interesting thing going on here. He's got 8 total shot attempts through 3 games, 5 shots on goal through the 3 games. Seattle is a team this year. I mean, we've talked about this in years past. They don't really have volume shooters, right? Oliver Bjorkstrand's maybe and maybe Jared McCann are like the closest you have to it. This year, I mean, Brandon Montour is your shots leader, both in attempts and shots on goal. And it's not particularly close, especially in shot attempts. I do think that is something also that this forward group needed, was somebody who's just going to have the mindset of, if I'm anywhere in the vicinity for a shot on goal, I'm just going to go ahead and take it. And we've seen some of the guys kind of have that change in mindset. I think Jaden Schwartz is somebody in the the last couple weeks that has kind of had that change in mindset. But I do think that the top six in particular needed more of that. And so far, it seems like Capo Caco is doing that. So that's been another kind of positive for me beyond just the physical aspects that he brings and all of that good stuff. Already has 9 hits through 3 games, making his physical presence felt despite only playing about 13 and a half minutes a night so far. As for the trade and everything around it, RJ, like I said earlier, I wasn't really expecting something like this from Ron, but I do think that it was an encouraging sign from him that he went ahead and made this move before the Christmas break, before New Year's, before the halfway point of the season, because he was looking at this team and saying, look, we're a 500 club. We need to do something to start getting on the positive side of that. Obviously, the results have not been there. I won't bury that lead, but given the time he made the trade and the nature of making the trade for somebody who was a former second overall pick, targeting somebody who was a national storyline, we're not really used to Ron making a move like that.
And I think that's why the deal surprised us. We weren't really expecting him to be that aggressive, even though we were talking about a trade for that specific player. We were talking about potentially a pending free agent going out the door to bring a player like that in and maybe adding some things for it, right? We saw the framework of the deal coming, but we didn't think that Francis would be aggressive enough to go ahead and pull the trigger on it. And I'm glad that he was. For all the criticism that we're going to, I'm sure, give to Ron Francis later on in this episode that we have been recently, and I think that is warranted. This trade was good, and I think the value was good on it as well. And I like that he pressed that button. Look, he pressed the button that nothing really ended up happening. It didn't work, but I think you have to at least do something like that and try and see if it can jumpstart the team. And that's all you can do as a GM, right? You can't make the players individually feel the pressure from that and go play better. They have to do it themselves. But I like that he made the trade. As for the value on the trade and what goes out the door, so Will Borgen goes back to the New York Rangers, and I know a lot of Kraken fans, sad to see him go, and we'll miss having him around, of course. But you have Will Borgen, a 3rd round pick, and a 6th round pick for Capo Caco, and I think the value on this deal is very good. Seemed like that was pretty much the consensus around the league too, as far as people reacting to it. Borgen, a pending free agent, it did make sense to move him out. His contract was up at the end of this year. He almost certainly was not going to be back with the Kraken. So that is somebody that you could look to move. And then 3rd and 6th round picks. I'm not really concerned about losing those picks. The Kraken have a pretty robust prospect pool anyway. And then Borgen, of course, also he wasn't playing very well this season. Mm-hmm. He had been outperformed by Josh Mahura. Mahura's been able to kind of step into that spot in the lineup. And I think despite the Krakens losing recently, Mahura still looked pretty good.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that it's, 3rd pairing defenseman changes that has kind of led to the Kraken being in the spot that they're in right now. 5-game losing streak, 4 games below 500. That really hasn't done it. But yeah, I think that it was a really solid trade. Like it just kind of works. I don't really feel like either side totally got the better of it. I think from the Kraken standpoint, you were better able to address an immediate need than maybe what the Rangers are getting back in Will Borgen. I don't know that Will Borgen really helps them deal with the kind of disaster that they're in right now. Although I have seen a couple of national reporters say that, really what they're getting in Will Borgen is the opportunity to flip him closer to the deadline potentially and get something for him there because he is a pending UFA. But the Kraken bringing in Capo Caco, RJ, who is a pending RFA. So they're going to retain the ability to, kind of have him be a part of this organization. This was a trade not just for the rest of this year, but in theory for many years to come as they start this, relationship with him. That's, I think, the other big thing for me. And we talked about this last week, brought it up a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at different ways that teams around the league have kind of rebuilt, and bringing in a guy who's 23, who does have the super high draft pedigree of being a 2nd overall pick. This is very in line with, the kinds of builds that like the Florida Panthers have done, where they've gone out and gotten top 5 draft picks that have struggled with their initial team, brought them in, put them in a different, spot in terms of in the lineup, been able to build up their confidence on and off the ice, all of that kind of stuff. And we talked that that's really the model the Kraken should be emulating. They took their first step to do that with this trade.
Yeah, it's the type of deal, as we talked about in last week's deep dive, projecting it, right? It's the type of deal that the Kraken should be looking at, where you're chasing a little bit of that upside, and the risk is so low too. When you're sending a pending free agent out the door, and a couple mid-round draft picks, you can go after a guy who was a former second overall pick and see what he has, right? When a player is drafted that high, there is talent there, and often development doesn't go the way that it can or that you'd hope. And Kako particularly, he wasn't getting the opportunity in New York. He was stuck behind a lot of really skilled players because that team was very good. And so now I think we're going to have the opportunity to see what he can do in a larger role. And I like that the plan for him right away, as Ron Francis said after the trade, he said he's going to start off in the top 6 and we're going to find a spot for him on the power play. And I like that phrasing too, find a spot for him. We're going to make sure he's there. It's not like, okay, he's going to have to kind of get it and earn it. We'll see. No, we're going to make sure that he is on the power play and he gets those opportunities. And that's what you have to do when you bring in a player like that.
Yeah, and I think for some of the longer term development stuff and things to watch for later this season, we'll get to that later, and we can talk about that with Kaapo Kakko then at that point. As for, like I said, the situation pending RFA with ARB rights, RJ, because he hasn't had a big season from a statistical standpoint, he hasn't been chewing up those top 6 minutes and everything. I think this is an addition, just kind of forecasting ahead where the Kraken are going to be able to work something out with him that's not going to break the bank.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably see. It all depends on how this season goes, but I'd be surprised if they didn't at least make a go at re-signing him. They should probably at least give him a qualifying offer and keep him on board. But yeah, you could sign him to maybe a 2-year deal or something kind of shorter term, so you can really see what you have in him. And if he is able to take that next step, it could look like a steal for the remainder of that next deal. And so it gives you a player that works for now and the future, and somebody that you could potentially have as a middle 6 forward going forward, and somebody who's cost controlled too. He's 23, right? He's got, I think, 3 or 4 more years until he hits unrestricted free agency. And so that's going to help you as far as having a cheaper player around too, that you can fill out in the middle of the lineup.
Exactly. And to kind of transition over into maybe larger team composition, questions around Ron Francis and everything, RJ, I really think that is key, because as the Kraken are in this, 5-game losing streak and everybody's, wondering kind of again for the third time in 4 years, what's the issue with this team? Why can't they find consistency? Why can't they kind of make those in-game adjustments, changes that they need to? I know some people have talked about it maybe being a coaching problem. I really don't think it is. I know you agree with that. You don't think it is. We can talk about that in a second. I really think that some of it just has to do with this group and the fact that, look, you're on your second coach and they're struggling with the same issues. And when it comes to this group, it was assembled by one person. And I know, people have been talking about whether or not we think Ron will come back. It's hard to say, all of that stuff. But I will say this, there's one thing that makes me think that if this season kind of continues on the trajectory that it's on right now, that maybe Ron won't be back, or he will be kind of moved in the organization out of the GM role. And that is because this year you had a high payroll, right? Like, this was unlike in previous years where you had cap space and you weren't necessarily spending to the cap. This year you spent to the cap to the point where you were in the top 3 at one point in terms of cap hit. You could only have 20 guys on your roster because you had 0 cap space. And here you are, as a team with top 5 payroll, and you're in line to pick top 5 in the draft. And generally, when general managers are in that spot and it's not their first year with the team, it does not end well for them.
Right. And that's, I think you kind of hinted at that reason on our last post game. It is something you kind of leave as to why you think that pressure is really on Ron Francis. And I agree that is important context, right? We talk about expectations for this season and what everyone should be expecting. And are the playoffs a reasonable expectation? I know it's the expectation that Ron Francis sets for himself. And of course, you never want to say as a GM, well, we're not expecting to make the playoffs this year, right? But I think as soon as you go out and spend to the cap and you sign Montour and you sign Stevenson and you are right up there and you spend every last dollar, well, I guess they had about $4,000 of cap space left, with the limited roster, but you essentially spend every last dollar that you had, playoffs becomes the absolute minimum from an expectation standpoint. And so that becomes the bar, and the Kraken are nowhere near it. They are in the bottom 5 of the league right now as far as points percentage. And I don't know, at some point we can get into talking about how realistically unlikely the playoffs are at this point. But that is fair to, I think, hold somebody to account when they assemble a roster that's right up there against the Captains performing like this.
Right. And as you know, this caused me to kind of take another fresh look at the composition of this group, RJ. I think the one thing that really stands out as to, you know, this team and the way it's built versus really every other team in this league is just all of the middle class contracts, right? And the fact that, you know, you and I have talked about, and I know you definitely have talked about this in various forms, and I'm sure, you know, many times on your Armchair GM streams and all of that kind of stuff. Teams don't really hand out those middle class contracts anymore, those $5.5 million, $6 million deals, because, you know, it's better to just go all out, really truly pay for your really good difference making players. And then you can just generally find guys at lower level contracts or cost controlled contracts, whether they're, you know, RFA years, or you bring up guys if you draft well and have a good prospect pool, kind of similar to what the Kraken have now or have been developing. And you're able to, you know, kind of fill out the roster around them, getting realistically the same production that the Kraken are getting out of a lot of their middle six guys, just paying them a fraction of the cost. And it allows you to really be aggressive in free agency, aggressive in trades, aggressive at bringing in those difference making players, which has been something the Kraken have struggled with. And right now this roster has basically no maneuverability. And it's really because you have a top 9 that is just being paid so much money from kind of 1 through 9.
And you don't really see that when you look around the league. And I know it is tough when, as the Kraken is an expansion team, right? A lot of those players that are usually fill those spots are draft picks that a team has that comes up and they're on their cheaper contracts because they're still younger and under team control. And the Kraken haven't had that luxury. Those guys haven't been able to kind of get in the lineup yet. You'll see that in the next couple of years. But it's still possible to go out and get players like that, whether it is a Capo Caco deal or Ellie Tolvanen previously, you know, where they're a little bit on the cheaper side. I'm more referring to kind of Tolvanen's last deal, right? But you can go get those players, or even like a Ty Karchi, I think is filling that role for the Kraken right now. And they brought an undrafted guy, right? He's not making all that much. And they can provide similar things to say, you know, you look at the Kraken's most six. I don't want to single out anybody because it's a problem of really effort. The whole composition. But you look at an Andre Burakovsky making $5.5 million and he's playing on the fourth line and he's kind of within healthy scratch territory at this point. That type of play or that player could be replaced. Certainly that production that he's had could be replaced by somebody making a lot less. Brandon Tanev, as much as we love him, right? He's still essentially for most of the time playing a fourth line role, and you can kind of get those energy players making a lot less. And so that's where you are spending more than you need to in the composition of this group. Doesn't look like a lot of other teams in the league. And I did ask Ron Francis about this, after year 2, going into that off season, about it, if that's something intentional that he's trying to do and he wants to keep that cost structure. And at that time, it was in the context of a playoff run where it seemed like teams really had a hard time hanging with that level of depth, right? They were one game away from the Western Conference Final. I said, is this something you want to continue? Because it seems like teams just don't have an answer for this. And he really pushed back on that. He said, no, you know, ultimately this is just a result of the expansion process. We had to be built this way. But over time, you do get that different salary structure where you have the higher end contracts, you have the lower end contracts, and that's just kind of the way it gravitates for every team. So I don't think this is necessarily even by design or the way that Ron Francis wants it to be or feels that it has to be. It's just the way that it has been constructed. I don't even know that he would say it's ideal.
Yeah, and yet, RJ, he
keeps steering into it.
Right, yes. He keeps giving them out. And that's the weird thing here, because I'm looking at so many of these, right? There's the Chandler Stevenson deal, which was this past offseason. And, you know, it is what it is, right? We've talked plenty about it. But Jaden Schwartz was a free agent contract signing that Ron Francis made. Obviously, it was before the team ever played a game, but that was a middle-class deal that he signed. It wasn't one he inherited. Andre Burakovsky, one that he signed during a free agency window, not one that he inherited. You have those traded for Oliver Bjorkstrands, which, again, great trade. All these worked out great. But, you know, there are several of these that are that way. You look at even like on the back end, on the blue line, right? Not to ignore that group, but Adam Larson and the extension that he just signed, right? Like it's another kind of middle of the road kind of contract where it's 5.25 for a defenseman, and it's like, is he one of your difference makers like a Vince Dunn or a Brandon Montour who you are paying to be a difference maker versus, can you find somebody to maybe give you the defense at a level that over the life of this contract, a 35-year-old Adam Larson's going to give you.
Yeah, and you probably can elsewhere, and
Yeah.
we very well might see that in a year or two from Ville Ottavainen. There are players that you can bring in that'll probably do that for you, and so these contracts they add up. That's the thing too. It's not just one or two of them if you need to bring in the right player, fill in the right hole, but 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm counting. They add up.
And Jordan Eberle too. Like that's it. He is on that extension that they signed him to last year. Like that is another one, right? And again, these players have all like performed at different levels. Some of them I think have worked out much better than other ones. But it's just an example of these are all contracts that he did not inherit. He's actually given out. He has displayed a pattern of behavior that indicates he's going to kind of continue to try to bring in guys to that like middle 6 or top 6 role, and he's going to kind of pay that inflated free agency price for them rather than maybe waiting off or trying a young guy, even if it's maybe a year too soon, or making some sort of trade for somebody involving those prospects or draft capital, or moving assets out to bring in somebody who's going to be on a different contract either above or below. And it's one where I just look at it and I go, that's really what's kind of strangling this team, is the fact that you have the most expensive middle 6, it feels like, out there in the NHL, and you're getting so little from it. I look at the points and stuff, and I mean, really, nobody's producing points at a high level this season, but the amount of these guys that are producing at half a point per game, or just about there, maybe plus or minus 5 points from half a point per game, it's just not enough. And at some point, in the next year or two, really, you're going to be able to replace a lot of these guys with guys in your prospect pool that, yes, they might only end up being middle 6 wingers for you, but they're going to be on ELCs. They're going to be cost controlled for many years, right? The value that they're going to add to your organization, even if they only produce at the same amount, but just by giving you that money at the high end to potentially go out there and get a Mitch Marner if he's available and decides he wants to go to Seattle, right? Like, just having that flexibility from having those guys step into the lineup over the next couple of years and kind of moving out some of these contracts is going to be so massive and important to this team trying to get over that hump to become a consistent playoff contender.
And I know that's one of the points that you wanted to make at the end of your prospect chat, right? When you're talking about the prospect pool as a whole.
Yeah.
And I'll try not to, put too many words in your mouth, but you were explaining to me how, yes, there aren't a ton of guys that project to be bona fide superstars, right, in that prospect pool, and that a lot of them do project to be middle 6 players, but that's okay because of the cost savings that it gives you. Even if they are just all middle 6 players, you have so many of them that project that way, and they can go and fill these spots instead.
Yeah, and they all have potential in the way that a lot of
one or two of those
don't.
guys could hit and be that level above.
Exactly. If you give them the same ice time that some of these guys are getting in the middle 6 for you now, who knows what you're going to be able to get from them. Are you going to be able to get more if you play a Carson Rykhoff 15 and a half minutes a night than Yanni Gourde's 5 goals through 32 games? So there's a very distinct possibility you will be getting more from it, and he's going to cost you about $4.5 million less. Right? Like that's a huge swing as far as what your team is and what you're able to do. And I think that that's another thing that's, again, it's something worth looking forward to, but I do have my concerns of if Ron Francis stays around, RJ, if he goes into another round of free agency with this group, yeah, the Yanni Gourde contract's going to be gone. Yeah, Brandon Tanev's going to be gone. I don't entirely not trust him just to go out there and find the 5th best forward in the free agency class and sign him to $5 million. And that Yanni Gourde contract's right back on the books.
Yep. No, that has been the pattern that we've seen, and I think they need to get away from it. I don't have a lot of confidence that Ron Francis would be the guy to get the team away from it. I share your concern there.
Yeah. So we'll see what ultimately ends up happening, but I will say I do think that when you are a general manager in any sport and you have a payroll that is in the upper, tippy top of the league, and your team performs at this level and ends up in this spot where you are kind of out of it by Christmas and you are projected to be picking in the top 5, that is a really difficult thing to overcome when it comes to end of year review time. I will say that.
Yes. In a results driven business like sports, that's
Yes.
well said. Yeah. When,
Yeah.
when it comes time for that review, it's hard to justify. And so you mentioned that, yeah, out of it by Christmas, you said. And so I think we ought to address kind of where the Kraken are at this point. And unfortunately, out of it by Christmas seems not all that inaccurate. Look, let's look at where the Kraken are in the standings. I mean, they are currently closer to the bottom of the league. They're in the bottom 5 of the league, but they're closer to the bottom of the league than they are to the last playoff spot.
And bottom 5 in terms of point percentage, because the Kraken have played more games. So if you're just looking at points, if you go like into the NHL app, it might not look that way, but because the Kraken have played more games and done less with them, points percentage wise, they're in the bottom 5.
Exactly. Thank you for clarifying that. And so now looking back just to points as well, there's 7 points out of a playoff spot. Depending on how the games go later today, they're probably going to be 8 points out of a playoff spot heading into Christmas. And to put that in some context, the mountain they have to climb, no team in the NHL in the last 15 years has been 8 points out of a playoff spot at Christmas and made the playoffs. So they're looking to do something that hasn't been done since the 08-09 Buffalo Sabres, if they are to climb back in and actually get into the playoffs, into the top 16 teams in the league. And that's the mountain that they're looking to climb. And you look at the analytics and the models instead, they're somewhere in the 1% to 3% chance, if you want to put it into context like that, to make the playoffs. And most of those models now have the Kraken with a higher chance at the number 1 overall pick than they have at making the playoffs. And so that's where they're at. I think this is the basis for a lot of the conversation that we're going to have right now about changing the expectations and having that mental shift. The playoffs for this team this year looks extremely, extremely unlikely. It's something that almost unprecedented in the cap era, right? That a team would be able to come back like this. Even the 2019 St. Louis Blues, we always point as an example, were only 7 points out at this time at Christmas. So it's a tough road ahead for the Kraken. They have a lot of ground to make up. They put themselves in a very deep hole. And you look at the effect for this team, like there's no sugarcoating it. It is a devastating result for a team that spent to the cap, as we just talked about. And they did that because they know how important this year is, specifically this year, because you have the new TV deal, because you have so many more eyeballs watching this team. There's a reason they put all the resources they did into making this team good right now, even if the Stevenson and Montour contracts might age poorly. They signed to a long-term deal. But because this year was so important, to at least be playing meaningful games throughout the entire season. That's the thing. Maybe you don't make the playoffs, but if you were at least in it the entire time and you're in April playing games right there on the playoff bubble, even if you don't make it, there's a case you could make that it's a successful year because everybody's following, because you have the new TV deal. And we're well on the way to the opposite. I mean, the Kraken, as I've just explained, are pretty much out of it by Christmas. And this is not something they've experienced really since year 1. And frankly, it's the only thing that this franchise absolutely could not afford this season.
Yeah. And it is like kind of worst case scenario, right? Like it really did. There was just so much optimism around all of the different moves that this organization did, not just the ones that around the roster, but like, as you said, the TV deal. It just felt like there was a real change, and there needed to be change after last season in a lot of regards. And they bring in Dan Bylsma, promote him up from Coachella Valley, where there's been a lot of success and everybody just speaks highly of it. And the vibes down there have just been impeccable. And you have the optimism around him, and he brings up Jess Campbell with him, somebody who's done a great job of being able to one-on-one work with players and help them develop. And you look at having Shane Wright around for a full season, and Matty Beniers maybe getting back on track, and all of these things just look so promising going into the year. And essentially what it's turned into, RJ, is the back half of last season. Like, it just feels like we're right back kind of trending towards that, where early on in the year, teams able to have some good results, play some good games, win against some good teams, have a good road trip, all that kind of stuff, but also, inexplicably drop 3 games in a row to the 2 teams at the bottom of the Pacific Division. I guess, well, now you're one of those 2 teams from a points percentage standpoint, as Anaheim has passed you. But you know what I mean? Like they had those weird downturns where it was just like, why are we losing this game? Or why does it not look like we're even close in this game? And it just it kills me, because I really did buy into a lot of the changes that they were making, and I do still believe that they are good changes, right? The TV deal, it's still the thing that needed to happen for this organization. We talked about it in the past, right? Just the increased viewership, the increased fan base, all of that kind of stuff is absolutely something that needed to happen for the long-term health of the franchise, regardless of results and everything. They just needed the ability for fans to be able to more easily watch them and become true diehard fans. That does appear to be happening. Even though the results haven't been great, it still looks like it's happening. And we could talk about the young players developing. I was thinking maybe we save that for last to end on something a little bit positive after a lot of this podcast.
Let's do that.
But it is one where it's from an actual team standpoint, I just truly felt like we were going to be in a spot where we were going to be talking about this team in a much more competitive way heading into February, March, the trade deadline, than it looks like we're going to. As you know, the Western Conference is tough this year, and a lot of teams are making pushes, and they're at least being able to tread water at 500 in a way that you can't. And that's just ultimately disappointing. And again, to come back around to the coaching thing and to kind of broaden it out, so many people have been saying, it doesn't look like this coaching staff can make the adjustments that need to be made, RJ, or, there needs to be some sort of drastic change. Fans want some sort of action, something tangible to kind of make up for the fact that this season has been disappointing. And one of the easier things to do in that scenario is to go out and make a coaching change. But just to kind of reiterate the points that we've been making on a lot of these post-game lives, when we see those, you just made a coaching change. Right? Like, so much of this issue with inconsistent play from this group, or the group maybe not being able to start on time, we were saying all of those same things under Coach Dave Haxtell, right? All of that has carried over to Dan Bylsma, and Dan Bylsma is a very different coach in the way that he approaches the game, the systems that he's asking them to play, whether it's, systems X's and O's wise, or from like a philosophical way of approaching coaching and having that relationship with players. Just very different than Dave Haxtell. And the fact that you're having those same issues with this group of inconsistent play, not being able to start on time, or waiting too long to get going in a game, feeling like it needs, like there's something has to happen for them to kind of wake up and get going. The fact that that's happening with somebody who coaches so differently than Dave Haxtell tells me that coaching was not the issue. Right? This is an issue beyond coaching. This is an issue with the players. And as I know you want to point out, I could let you point it out. It's not even, or I'll say this. We know that the coaches are trying to make those in-game adjustments. They are trying to make those changes that people are saying that they're not making, because we get to hear from the assistant coaches at every second intermission. And if you listen to them, more often than not, they are saying the same things you and I are saying to each other, as far as what this team needs to do to get in this game, or what they've really been struggling with in this game that they need to address and they need to fix. If the coaches are telling us that as fans, and they're willing to say that publicly in a way that the other team could be listening to and hear, right? And maybe that's going to open a can of worms of people saying they shouldn't, which I don't think is the problem. It means they're telling the players. And the fact that the players aren't responding to that, given it's a different coaching staff with a different approach to how they're going to interact with the players, tells me that's a player issue. And RJ, you think it even goes one step further.
I do. And the interviews, really, the intermission interviews on the broadcast, which, by the way, one of the wonderful pieces of the new TV deal, the Kraken Hockey Network, I love how they have the assistant coaches coming on and how they're willing to talk about the things they need to change and adjust, especially Jess Campbell.
Yeah, she's
absolutely
the one.
Love those from Jess Campbell, right? But as you said, that's the indicator, right? They're telling everybody on TV the changes they need to make. And it's largely the same things that we see as we're watching the game that the Kraken need to change. And I do think it goes one step further, because especially recently, I've been paying attention to those interviews. and not just the ones at second intermission with the coach, but the ones at first intermission with the players. And that's where it's really stood out to me too, where you look at that Yanni Gourde interview that certainly circulated quite a bit, and in between the unacceptable, awful as far as how they played in the first period, and that honest language from him. But he was talking about the same things that the coaches were saying, as far as needing to simplify their game, get pucks in deep, go to work, and just try and cycle, try and forecheck, and play the game that they want, instead of trying to make these fancy plays at the blue line where they're giving it up and feeding the opponent's transition. Yanni Gourde was going through those talking points one by one. So not only are the coaches telling the players, but that tells me the players are receiving that message. Like, they know what they need to do, and yet it's still not being done. And I think that makes it all the more perplexing, but it also, I think, just points the arrow that much more firmly at the players, that this is a problem of the players and this group of players, that even when the coaches are telling them to do the right things, even when they know, or they could tell and repeat to us back the right things they're supposed to do, they're not going out and doing those things. And I don't know what more of an indictment you could need, right, on what's going wrong. As a coaching staff, all you can do is tell them. And if the players listen and hear it, then you've gotten that message through. And so when it still isn't happening, it's pointed squarely at the players, or alternately the GM who brought this collection of players together.
Right. And that's so often, as a coach, the battle that needs to be won is that one of recognizing what the problem is and then communicating it to the players. Sorry. Ugh, my voice is really starting to go. That is the difficult process. Again, Dan Bylsma is really good at doing that, though. He's really good at being able to communicate with the players. The players respond to him, whether it was at Coachella Valley or we are seeing it with the Kraken up here. That's normally like the issue with coaching. That seemed to at times be the issue last year, as every player ended their exit interviews with, "I don't know what happened," right? That was your issue under the previous coaching staff. It's not your issue now. The issue is the players having a disconnect between consciously knowing what needs to happen and then what they're actually doing on the ice when they get into a game scenario and they jump over the boards and they just kind of let their old instincts take over, or their old habits take over, and they just kind of go out there and they do the same thing that doesn't work, right? And that becomes then just a concentration issue, or is something, but it's an issue with the players.
Sorry, Dylan. Yeah, I know your voice kind of going. You've got the bug that everyone has
Everybody's got
really
it, yeah.
over the last couple of weeks. I'll try and buy a little bit of time, but I think you make a really good point there. Is they just, for whatever reason, just go back into these habits, and that is the difficulty with coaching, right? And I'm glad you brought up the exit interviews too, because that's the big difference, right? At the exit interviews last year, the guys were saying, I don't know. We just didn't have it. I don't know what we need to do differently. And that was the big thing that needed to be fixed. And Bylsma at least has fixed that. They know what they're supposed to go do. I'm baffled by it. I really am.
Yeah. So it does put them in the spot where, we're basically saying, right, like there is something wrong with this core, right? Like this group of players that we talked about, right? The largely, like they're all signed to these middle class contracts, and that kind of hurts you from a cap perspective, and it's also hurting you on the ice because they're not producing. And like I said, vast majority of them are basically a half point per game player, which is not going to be good enough in today's NHL. And they seem incapable of applying adjustments or playing with consistency, and that's really what's kind of doing this team and why they're in the spot that they were in, where they languished at 500 for so long. And then ultimately now you're falling away from that. And you could literally go on a 4-game win streak right now, and all that would do is get you back to 500, and you'd still be looking at several points out of a playoff spot. Like that's where this team is at right now. 4-game win streak does nothing for you.
It does. And I mentioned a couple podcasts ago about how there's a time of the year where going from being 500 goes from being mid to being bad. And 4 games from now is well past that time. Mm-hmm. Even if you're 500 into the new year, that is bad. And like I've talked about the mountain they have to climb, it looks pretty insurmountable at this point, at least for this season, and trying to get to that ultimate goal of making the playoffs. So I think that, we have to know that. We have to start to accept that. And I think there is kind of a mental shift that needs to happen. And at some point it's going to happen with the team. where the team is going to adjust, certain decisions that they make and the ice time they give to the players and all of that. There's a certain point where the team is going to have to call it. I don't think that's happening quite yet. I think they're still going to go for it and not really face the music quite yet. And that's okay, because it is still, at least calendar wise, pretty early in the season. But that doesn't mean that we as people who watch the team and follow the team can't start to make that shift ourselves a little bit and kind of be proactive about it.
Yeah, exactly. So speaking of that and things that Kraken fans can maybe start looking to, because look, if they end up going on some crazy 13-game win streak and they really put themselves back in this spot, awesome. That's gravy. We'll all take it and we'll go on that ride with them and it'll be fun. But I think that, playoff expectations, aspirations even, we could probably remove that from the things that we're looking for and that we're, maybe tying ourselves emotionally to. I think we could kind of cut that tether and instead start looking towards, individual player performances is the easiest place to go and look at to find, things worth rooting for, things to still be emotionally invested in with this group, things to still engage with, and that you can still have some happiness from seeing, like the fact that Shane Wright is still kind of going on that tear. He's been on since he got scratched. It's still really impressive to see what he's been doing. I think the growth of Shane Wright and Matty Beniers getting back on track are really the two big things for me, RJ, that I'm going to start paying attention to down the stretch here with this group, because I think that that's something that is really important to this franchise long term. And it's something that, look, as the Kraken's, first round draft picks, and as the guys that are kind of the cornerstone building blocks of this franchise for the next decade, I do feel a little bit more emotionally invested in what they're able to go out there and do. I want them to go out there and win and have that personal success on the ice. So I think for me, the big things that I'm going to start looking for is really just that growth for the young guys on this team. And now that includes a Kaapo Kakko as well.
Right. And I think that is the most important thing for the Kraken long term, is making sure that those top players grow. We've talked about teams really, needing those top draft picks and to turn into players who can be cornerstone of the franchise. And that's certainly the case with the Kraken and with Matty Beniers and with Shane Wright. And also, as we get toward World Junior season starting on Boxing Day, with Berkeley Catton, because he's also going to be one of the centerpieces there. And so watching him in that tournament, I would highly recommend. I think it'll be a good kind of palate cleanser too for everybody. And the Kraken will have a lot of players in that tournament. But as far as the Kraken games, right, with Shane Wright and Matty Beniers, it's going to be really important to make sure that those two are developing properly and they get the most out of this season, because while on paper it can be lost time for the team as a whole, it can be very valuable time and reps for young players who are still trying to, kind of find their way in the league. And at a certain point, I said the Kraken are going to make this adjustment, right? And there's certain things I want to see when they do. I want to see, them experiment with different players that Matty Beniers can play with, kind of put him around the right guys. I think they've started doing that over the last month, but I want to see him get plenty of opportunities. And then for Shane Wright, I think this is, for me, the most important part of all this is I feel like the Kraken have a plan going with Shane Wright that's like a kind of a 3-phase plan. And I want to see it move into phase 3, and I want to see it managed well and go correctly. So you have to handle it delicately. But the way I see it is you had phase 1 of starting the season where he comes into the training camp looking really good, and you let him go and just see what happens, right? To start the season. He played really well, but didn't produce a whole lot. And then toward the tail end of it, right, he's not producing and he's also not playing all that best. And so then you have the reset for him. He's scratched for a few games. And then phase 2, you bring him back and you tell him, just get back to the way you were playing in training camp, and you try and build confidence. And so what they've done is they've put him really in a third line type of role. They gave him some good line mates in Tolvanen and Bjorkstrand, and then they switched it up recently. But you give him some good line mates, and you have him just feast on lower level competition and limited minutes. And oh boy, has that worked. 15 games since they did that, 14 points for Shane Wright. He is killing it in that role. But I think phase 3 then has to be, okay, you ramp up the challenge a little bit, right? You give him some tougher matchups, a little bit more ice time. You keep those good line mates with him, and you see what he can handle given that next challenge. And I think at some point you have to make that shift this season. You have to do it delicately. You have to kind of pick the right time. But I want to see them do that, and I want to see it go well. And I think we might even be starting to see a little hint of it, given that he tied his career high ice time in the last game. He did play a little bit more prominently in that Colorado game. He's playing with Jared McCann, the team's best forward. You know, they're giving him some good wingers. So I hope we kind of see that start to happen and that he can excel in that phase 3 of the plan that I'm guessing they have. Again, I don't, you know, I don't know that the Kraken have it separated like that. That's the way that I see it.
That would be the natural progression, right? Like that it tracks, right? Whether they have it on the books or not, it does make sense. I think you're on it there. And yeah, I really think that all of this year was supposed to just be, you know, phase 2, as you put it, right? Like that's why Chandler Stevenson's here, right? It was to put Shane Wright in a spot where he could come into the NHL, play on the third line, get those good matchups, not have to go out there and on some nights munch 18, 19 minutes going up against a Nathan MacKinnon, right? And he's just going to maybe get caved in, and you worry about him building confidence with his playability at the NHL level and all of that kind of stuff. That is why Chandler Stevenson exists on this roster, is literally just to still take those minutes away from Shane Wright. To a lesser extent, I think at times, Matty Beniers, in a similar way that Alexander Wenberg did in previous years. I don't think you needed to sign the center who was supposed to do that to a 7-year contract. That still doesn't make sense to me, but not to go down that rabbit hole. But that is why Chandler Stevenson's here. And I really do think going into the season, they were thinking, well, that's really the plan all year for Shane Wright, is we can give Shane Wright 13, 14 minutes a night. He can go out there against lesser competition, really build up his confidence, all that good stuff. And then next year at training camp, he can challenge Chandler Stevenson for that second line center spot. And if he takes it, awesome. Things are great. If he doesn't quite get it at the beginning of the year, maybe over the course of next season, he can get there and he can surpass him. But right now, Chandler Stevenson's not playing that great for you. Shane Wright is starting to excel and find that confidence and have that success. And it is far more important that you get him going now more than ever, because you are going to need a Shane Wright who can play at a high level in the NHL. I do think at some point they'll make that decision to make the switch. I do think they're going to be cautious with it. I don't know that we're going to see it right away. I think you might see like a little bit of uptick where he's getting an extra minute or two now. But as far as him maybe pushing for that, like, 17, 18 minute a night mark, I think that might be something that they reserve for like a post-trade deadline world where they really want to make sure the team's out of it, and they really want to make sure that he is comfortable and confident playing with guys like Jared McCann before they put him in that spot.
Or one thing I might like to see too is you do it maybe selectively by opponent too, where you don't go, if you're playing Colorado, no, you don't put him out there against Nathan MacKinnon for all those shifts. But say, looking at the schedule coming up, you're playing Columbus, right? You put him up there against their top line and just let him go to work against Sean Monahan. And I bet he could probably handle that. Or even like a San Jose, let him go against Macklin Celebrini and play those top minutes. Like if he can't handle that, at 20 to Celebrini's 18, like, you got to let him, go in certain matchups, I think. And that's the way that I would personally handle it. But yeah, you don't want to just put him in the deep end against some of the best, Edmonton. You're not having him face McDavid for 22 minutes a night. I get that.
Yeah. No, and I think there's something to that, right? I mean, that's similar to kind of the Berkeley Catton idea I had for next season, kind of working off what the Ducks did with Leo Carlsson. It's kind of, it's in that same vein, but it's not as extreme as full on benching him for certain games versus playing him, where it's just, you have him in different spots, you give him different amounts of ice time. I think that that's a good idea, and that's something that they could absolutely apply to the rest of this season. And it, in theory, should be getting the job done as far as moving his development forward and not letting him kind of stagnate, because that's the one thing you don't want, is him to kind of just, get used to playing against only third line competition level opponents. And then when he does have to make that jump, if there's an injury or next season, you just want him there. And then all of a sudden he's kind of having to relearn things all over again. You want him just to be applying the same habits and asserting himself kind of, that's the goal really. I'm looking at things, RJ, and we talk about Shane Wright there. I think Maddie has just been in some ways unlucky this season. We talked about this on one of the post-game lives this past week, and I thought it's worth mentioning here on the podcast. Maddie is shooting from high danger scoring areas more this year than in the past. It's actually where he's shooting the most from, is in and around the crease. That is where he is getting his shots. He has just been unbelievably unlucky with a this is a couple games old now, but it was 6.8% from high danger areas, where the league average is over 20% shooting percentage. That isn't just Maddie having a bad shot or being a little too predictable with where he places his shot. There's just bad luck involved in that. So I do think Maddie is making some strides in theory to be bouncing back from the rough year that he had last year, RJ. It's just been like the universe is just fighting back against him hard.
Yeah, it really does seem to, we really dug into these numbers too, and we really weren't expecting to find what we found. I think we were expecting to maybe find that he wasn't shooting from the right areas, or that he wasn't, playing in the way that he had when he was successful. But no, he's going to the right areas. He just seems to be getting very unlucky. And I mean, even from a points perspective, you look at his last 12 games, he's got 8 assists. He doesn't have any goals, but he's got 8 assists and like 8 points in 12 games for the type of player that Maddie is, where we know he's never going to be somebody who produces giant numbers offensively, but like that's decent production over this last stretch. And you throw the odd goal or two, you get a bounce or two, and those numbers look really good for Matty Beniers. And so I'm not as worried about him as maybe some people are. Look, at a certain point, I think it's 18 games now he's gone without a goal. At a certain point, you have to score. At a certain point, that production has to come. But I think that could actually be something that really helps if the Kraken are kind of clearly out of it, right? It takes some of that pressure off a player like Matty Beniers, where you can kind of get through one of those streaks where it's just unlucky, and you don't have to worry about that missed goal here or there being one that costs the team a playoff spot, because the stakes just aren't that high.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. And the difficult challenge at that point for the coaching staff becomes, especially with these young guys, is keeping them playing at that level of when they were feeling like the team was competing every night. And right as the team kind of recognizes or comes around to the idea that, the season's not going to really happen for them and everything, what you want to have is that Maddie continues to go out there and tries and is able to continue to play at this level without that pressure, right? What you want to be on the lookout for as a coaching staff is, when that happens, it's very easy for a lot of guys to maybe take a step back, right? Ramp it down just a little bit, because, why shouldn't I, right? Like there's a reasonable thought process there around that. Nobody wants to hear it. Nobody would ever admit it. But look in any sport at teams in that scenario, it happens. And so I think that is something that the coaching staff would need to kind of be on in that scenario, is just to make sure that Maddie still goes to those areas, even though the pressure for the game as a whole is off, just for his own good and his own benefit.
And I know you don't want to maybe put too much more on his plate, but something for a little bit further down the line of the season, maybe once he scores a goal at some point, I'd love to see him on the PK. And I know we've talked about this for a long time, for years, but if the Kraken are out of it, why not try Maddie out on the PK?
I still don't know why. Why not try it
even
now?
When you're in it, I think they should. Yeah, exactly. Try it now. But I would like to see that for him as well.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, gosh, I'm like, it's been driving me crazy for so long. Kind of maybe last thing here, RJ, and unless you have more that you kind of want to get out for this podcast, what about this insane idea? And maybe this is insane. I don't necessarily think it's that insane if you really do believe in this player, and it would send a message to a lot of guys that are probably still going to be around next year. It would really send a big message to the core. What if at the end of the year, RJ, you're out of it? You bring up Berkeley Catton and you use him for the last 9 games of the regular season. You can work his ELC slide in, but you're sending a message of you're getting him some NHL experience. You kind of get to see him against NHL competition before next year, where you're going to have to make a call on maybe whether or not he's ready for it. And potentially more importantly, you are sending a message to all of those guys with those middle-class contracts on this roster of, we will absolutely replace you with somebody on an ELC who is 19 years old if we think that they give us a better chance of winning. So you guys better figure it out.
I do like the message that sends, and I think it might be good for Catton as well. I would like to see it at the end of the year, and I do wonder. I went to go check the end of the year's schedule to see opponent wise because I think it is important that you kind of
Yeah.
tailor it, and not give. I mean, the end of the schedule being in reverse order, like L.A., St. Louis, Vegas, Utah, L.A. Like those are some maybe some
tough,
physical
yeah.
big teams. You don't want to break him. That's the number one
Yes.
thing. You want to make sure that he is physically okay. But I think if you kind of tailor it around some of those games, you do have a San Jose game in there. Utah should probably be okay. That maybe that could work. And yeah, I think also too, look, we remember last season when the Kraken were out of it with roughly 20 games to go, how much of a slog that was and how kind of exhausting that was for the fan base, right? Who had to follow this team after they're out of it. That was about 20 games ish, a little under. We got 46 games to go.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of season left. And if we get to that point, I feel like there might be a lot of fatigue from the fans' perspective. And I feel like that's something that could also capture the fans' attention a little bit and kind of give some hope at the end of the season for the future. And so beyond what it does for Berkeley Catton or for the message that it sends the team, I think that could be really helpful for the franchise as a whole, even off the ice.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was last year when we got Shane Wright for that stretch of games.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a good
huge,
comparison, right? Or, year one when Matty Beniers came in.
Yep, exactly. So I think
the team has done before.
I think it is something. There are two obvious negatives to this that I will say, because I'm sure people are already trying to leave a comment or come at me on Discord or something. The two negatives are, one, you would rip away Berkeley Catton from a team that's absolutely going to the WHL playoffs. And depending on the time of year, maybe their playoffs have already started. So you're just kind of pulling him out of playoff mindset in the WHL and sticking him into the NHL. Might not be the greatest idea there. I will admit that one. The other one is, it is unclear to me. I think you can only do the ELC slide once. And so if next year you want to potentially do that with him at the beginning of the season, where you want to see, hey, is he going to be able to hang at the NHL level, and you can play him the 9 games at the start of next season, you might want to save that for that. Or is he going to be too old by the end of that season?
I don't know, but you can do an ELC slide.
Oh,
twice.
okay. I thought you could
There's
only
not
do
a
it once.
one-time limit,
Right.
but then there is the age limit, which we haven't looked at.
Yeah, we'd have to figure out the
closely.
age limit and the birthday thing and all of that. But because like that's why it burned a year off Matty's contract at that year one 10-game stint that he had. But that would be like another thing is you might want to. There's a reason teams usually save that for the beginning of a season, not late in the season, right? Like because generally your player is going to be in a playoff scenario, and Berkeley Catton absolutely will be with Spokane, so you do want to worry about that. There is a reason for that. Maybe it's instead you bring up one of the other prospects from Coachella Valley, right? You bring up a Jagger Furcus or a Chalet or Yanni Newman or somebody who is playing well down there, and you give them the opportunity to try to send that message. But I feel like it doesn't send as strong a message to the players on the group that it's like, oh, well, this guy who's progressing anyway is coming in. It doesn't seem as message sendy as bringing in the 19-year-old out of major junior.
Yeah. Speaking of, it's a different kind of message, but speaking of message sending, I just want to throw this out because it's kind of amusing. Apparently a bunch of Devils fans right now, the Devils are playing the Rangers as we record this, and the Devils fans have started a Capo Caco chant as the Rangers are losing that one. So I just thought that was fun. I
was going to say to bookend the
5-0.
Oh my gosh.
Game is 5-0. The Rangers are losing. And yeah, so the taunting over Capo Caco, who did score last night for the Kraken, has already begun. So
yeah, I mean, look, nobody was more upset about the Capo Caco trade than Rangers fans. It seemed like there was not a good thing said about that trade from Rangers Nation, it felt like, and that makes me feel really good about the job that Ron Francis did in that one particular move. We obviously talked about all of the other moves he's been making, and maybe those haven't been as successful, but it is really nice when you make a trade for a guy and that other team's fan base is just kind of furious at how it all went down.
Yeah, no, that is nice to see. And it's a feeling Kraken fans haven't really gotten a whole lot. Maybe that and the Bjorkstrand trade are the two.
Yeah.
Where the feeling from the other fan base is just, man, we got fleeced.
Mm-hmm.
Like to see it more often.
Yeah. At least with, for Columbus fans, they understood the scenario. They were in cap hell and they needed to get out of it, and moving Bjorkstrand had to happen. Rangers fans weren't in that spot, right? Like there's a lot of frustration over the return. There's a lot of frustration of just feeling like they wasted Kaapo Kakko while he was there. And yeah, it's not a good time there in New York if you're a Rangers fan or part of that organization, it sounds like, from all the reporting. But that's better stuff saved for our other podcast over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, just to plug that. And of course, want to plug the law offices of Rico Tessendor one more time here at the end of the podcast. It's wonderful having him on again. Thank you, everybody, so much for all the kind words that you left on last week's podcast or on Discord or just around talking to us. It really does mean a lot when people engage with us around, stuff like that is more on like the business side of ECH, but that you're excited for us and excited to have him on board, and the fact that he is a Kraken fan and a listener of the podcast and everything. You guys really felt like he's one of you, and he is, and I think that that's a really cool thing.
Yeah, definitely. And that helps us a lot. And we're potential sponsors. They see that. They see how when you're part of the ECH community, the community takes care of you too. So we really appreciate that from everybody. Yeah.
And thanks one more time to him. Again, you can go if you ever need it, right? Hope you don't, but if you ever need it, you can go and get a free quote at ricotessendor.com or call 425-778-9800. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening, and we will see you all next time.
Hey everyone, before we go, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our awesome patrons over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, especially our Terror of the Deep patrons.
Thank you so much for making all this possible. We really appreciate your support.